So it's been a busy week at Tottenham. Over the weekend, Spurs were eliminated from the FA Cup after a 2-1 defeat at home to Aston Villa, meaning that Spurs' season pretty much is done now. I think all's left really to fight for is Europe, but whether or not we get it, maybe a different question. And of course, since then, we've also had a few injuries and another new signing. So let's get into what's been, a pretty hectic week at Tottenham. So before we get into the transfer news of Spurs signing Conor Gallagher, let's just briefly talk about the Aston Villa game. In terms of, performances, it wasn't, absolutely diabolical. There's been some instances like the Chelsea game at home. I thought we were absolutely awful. I don't think we were that bad against Villa. Second half and first half were two completely different teams. We pushed, for the first 20 minutes or so. Had a few times where we tried to get a tail over the top, but didn't really succeed in that. And then as soon as Villa, took the lead, they just took control of the game. And then getting the second before half time pretty much kills us in that game. And obviously that went on to be the winner. Second half, the team come out and, played with a bit more purpose, played with a bit more the sort of attacking rhythm and fluidity that a lot of us have been calling for this season. And I thought, the three that were behind Kolo Muani, obviously Richarlison got injured in the first half, looks like a hamstring injury. How severe that is, we don't know. We do know that Dominic Solanke returned in this game. But Kolo Muani come on for Richarlison, played up front, done okay. I don't think he was particularly great, I don't think he was particularly bad. But I was really impressed with the three behind Kolo Muani. So he had Tell on the left, Odegaard on the right, and Xavi Simons. And ultimately, the story of the game was that Spurs didn't get going quick enough, and it was too late. Too little, too late in that sense. But when the sort of shackles are released, and there's nothing really left to lose in that game, we play with a bit more attacking purpose. And I don't think it's a coincidence that once this sort of whatever sort of our game plan is, once that goes out the window, some of these players look a lot better. Matisse Tell, I think his last two games, they've really shown he's got something to add to this team, and he shouldn't be loaned out. I don't think Spurs should be looking to get rid of him at any point, especially given, sort of how stark we are for options, with the sale of Johnson, Kulusevski and Kudus still out. So I was really impressed with him. I thought his hold-up play was good. He put a few good balls in the box, was really trying to get in behind at every opportunity. Wasn't necessarily succeeding at every one, but he looked a lot better. And another player who I thought was really, one of the players who could leave the pitch with a head held high was Xavi Simons. I thought that was probably maybe his best game he's played for us. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the games that Simons has played well, and we've seen the best of Xavi Simons when our initial sort of game plan's gone out the window, which I think is a bit of a damning indictment on Thomas Frank. But he looked really good. He was coming deep, riding challenges, pushing us up the pitch, picking the ball up from deep areas and getting us high up the pitch. And earlier on in the season I said I didn't think he was that sort of player. I thought he's probably a bit more like a Dele Alli type 10, where he likes to get into the spaces beyond the striker and sort of be that second striker. But I was really impressed with what I've seen from him, and I think it just goes to show that this team is not as bad as people are saying it is. Some of the performances have been absolutely awful, don't get me wrong. I will absolutely agree with you on that one. But if we're looking at our, if we go through our squad, you've got Romero, who's a World Cup winner. You've got the large majority of the squad last year, all were good enough to win the Europa League. It's still quite a young squad, and I feel like it speaks more about Thomas Frank that these players, when we're playing sort of chaos ball, they thrive. And this is a team which was so used to playing that sort of football under Ange Postecoglou last year, playing gung-ho, not sort of looking to react. You're looking to be the pragmatist in those situations, and we've not seen Tottenham do that enough this season. With Thomas Frank, we've always been reactive and almost hyper aware of our weaknesses and the opposition's strengths rather than the shoe being on the other foot. But I thought Xavi Simons played well. Also impressed with Odegaard. Nice for him to get a goal as well, because I feel like he's been a player which, you know, he's pushing on this season, and sometimes it's he's been held back in terms of minutes, in terms of generally chances in the right sort of positions. But I thought he played well. But unfortunately, the story of the game is that it was a tale of two halves. And the first half, we were nowhere near good enough. And the second half, we showed a bit of fight, looked a bit dangerous. And that was the first time in quite a long time where I've quite enjoyed us, watching us and in that second half. And, part of me thinks that should be the blueprint for Thomas Frank, but I just don't think that he's the type of manager who's going to want to play that football all the time. I think he likes control in the sense of not being able to be dictated by, the other manager. So almost, sort of starting on the back foot and not allowing yourself to, be undone. Whereas Postecoglou was, as we said, a lot more of a pragmatist, and I think for Tottenham, and if you look back, and I know it's cliche about people who say, the Tottenham way, what does that even mean, and all these sorts of things, but if you look back at when we've been successful, through Arthur Rowe, the famous push and run team, not that I watched it, but obviously it's one of, the more famous teams in English football history. You've got the Bill Nicholson 61 team. You've got, the teams that won the FA Cups, the UEFA Cups in the 70s and 80s. We had Harry Redknapp's team, that played this football where we're always on the front foot. I had Pochettino's team who come, so close to not just the Premier League but the Champions League as well. And I feel like often that sort of attitude and that sort of football lends itself more to Tottenham than than some other clubs, and I genuinely just think that's the way it goes. I think if you look at Arsenal at the minute, I think they're a lot like some of the teams of yesteryear, where they do have some good individual quality, but ultimately they're solid defensively. And I feel like Spurs are the opposite of that, and that's why I'm not so confident that Thomas Frank would have seen. He would have seen how we performed in the second half and thought that's how we should play from the start, because I just don't think he thinks like that. But yeah, at the FA Cup and at the League Cup, in 14th in the league, it's not looking good in terms of this season. I know it's such a congested league, and we are not far off Europe, but I just don't think that we're consistent enough to finish in those European places. And I also think that generally the strength and the quality of other teams that are going to be competing, I feel like they've got a lot more cohesion from top to bottom in their football club, and ultimately I feel like that's what we're lacking at the minute. And it does feel like we're a bit unknown about what this new ENIC era will be. And for it to be run by the Lewis family still, and it was sort of rebranded as a sort of, how would I say it, it's almost like a new beginning for Spurs, but ultimately the scars of ENIC's ownership are still there at Tottenham, and I think it's going to take something quite big, and ultimately fans are still sceptical about ENIC. Just because Daniel Levy's gone, I don't think the heat's necessarily gone away from ENIC. And I have my reservations about how confident I am that they will deliver, and also add into the mix Fabio Paratici leaving at the end of the January window, and I do think there's questions to be asked about what's going on upstairs. But they've gone out, and we've seen a problem that we've identified. We've seen Bergvall got injured at Bournemouth, and Bentancur got injured against Aston Villa, and we've addressed that with a new signing. So Tottenham Hotspur have addressed the midfield problem, which has, you know, come to fruition in the last sort of week or two with the injuries of Bergvall and Bentancur, and we've now gone in and we signed Conor Gallagher. And initially, I wasn't too sure because I think our midfield, we've got definitely enough midfielders. The quantity is not an issue, but I feel like we're lacking someone, you know, a deep passer who can sort of get us going and build up. And if you're to look at this, you know, to be quite harsh, you'd say, well, Gallagher is that same profile of midfield as Archie Gray, Papsar, Bentancur, Basuma. But I don't think this is the one to get annoyed at. I think this is a good signing. I really do. I think instantly he probably is our best midfielder already. And, you know, if he can show some of the form we've seen at Crystal Palace, we've seen it at Chelsea, we've seen it at Atletico Madrid, I think, you know, that is a good signing. And ultimately, I know a lot of people will see, you know, Conor Gallagher come in and they think someone who wins duels, someone who's not necessarily a passer, someone who's a lot of, you know, bundles of energy, winning the ball back and, you know, looking to sort of get high up the pitch and winning those sort of battles and duels. But what I will say is that this is the sort of signing that, even if you have reservations about Frank, whoever comes in next, if Frank isn't to be here at the end of the season, I can guarantee whichever manager comes in would be a lot happier with Conor Gallagher in the Tottenham team than without. And ultimately, I think it's a good signing. 25 years old. So Spurs put this up at 4 o'clock today. Tottenham Hotspur delighted to announce the signing of Conor Gallagher from Atletico Madrid. Obviously, England international, only 25, and it's a bit of a weird one that he's only 25 because he's got a lot of experience. I can remember him playing at Charlton, Swansea, and then obviously moving up to Crystal Palace, Chelsea, and then moving on to Atletico Madrid. So, you know, I'm still quite confident with this. I think it's a good signing. And, you know, for England international to join, and is someone who you can definitely see that's, you know, and I know there's reservations about club signings, but ultimately this is the sort of signing that I think most managers would want in their team. And I think it's a good bit of business. Around £35 million, you know, we've sort of, you know, the rumoured money that we got for Brennan Johnson. I think that's a good distribution of the funds. I was quite impressed with how we've just gone out there and addressed something straight away. And I think maybe the injuries of Bentancur and Bergvall have, you know, sort of sped up this process. I don't think, you know, that's a particularly like controversial thing to say. I think everyone sort of, you know, knew that this probably would get done. It did come out of nowhere, but, you know, the need for a midfielder was bigger because of those injuries. And Gallagher's a player which has been linked with Spurs for, it feels like, about 4 or 5 windows now, even since before he went to Atletico Madrid. And he sort of feels like a player which was always going to end up at Tottenham just because of how often he was linked and that sort of thing. And he sort of feeds into, there's a lot of, you know, talk about Spurs not really having an identity and things like that, but I think as fans and sort of idea of Tottenham were based on, you know, maybe your first team or your favourite team. And my first team was the Martin Yole team, and I can remember we seemed to just have, you know, a good few years where we go out and we just go and get good homegrown talent with potential. And I think that's something that we've, you know, generally done over the last 20 years. And I think with Conor Gallagher, this is a player who definitely could end up going to the Euros. I think he's a player which Gareth Southgate likes. He's someone that Southgate liked, I should say. And I also think he's someone that Thomas Tuchel is going to like. So ultimately, you know, whilst there is a lot of things to be mad at with Tottenham at the minute, I don't particularly think this is one of them. And it's one initially when I heard it, I was sort of in the school of, you know, what will he add that necessarily we don't already have, which I think is a fair criticism, but I think he's just better at being a bit of an all-rounder, not really specialising, then maybe Bentancur or Sarr. What this means for Archie Gray and Lucas Bergvall's minutes, I'm not so sure. I've been quite vocal this season in the fact that I'm quite unhappy with how Thomas Franks used Lucas Bergvall, and I feel like his development last year really has been stunted a little bit by Thomas Frank's use of him. But we're going to West Ham with Conor Gallagher in our ranks, and he's a player which I think's only missed around one game through injury, which I've seen on Transfermarkt in his whole career. So as we sit here on the 14th of January, I'm anticipating at least one injury for Conor Gallagher, just because of Spurs, and that's how the way it works. I could imagine probably by the time we reach the 14th of April, I'm sure he would have missed one with Spurs, just because that's just seems to be the way the cookie crumbles. But yeah, I'll see you after the West Ham game on Saturday, where hopefully Conor Gallagher's making his debut and we can pick up some points against a really, really bad West Ham team. And until then, up Spurs.